Okay, so while we're getting that pulled up and while you're voting and taking your seats, I just want to introduce our next speaker, Bob Quinn. Bob Quinn was raised on a 2,400-acre family-operated wheat and cattle ranch southeast of Big Sandy, Montana. What a name. After finishing a Ph.D. in plant biochemistry and returning to his family's farm in Montana, Bob started experimenting with organic wheat. In 1986, through his business, Montana Flour and Grains, he introduced an ancient grain similar to durum wheat. This grain was grown only organically and marketed under his own brand name, Kamut, and now over 4,500 different Kamut brand products are being marketed throughout the world, providing a new crop for over 250 organic farmers in Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Bob Quinn is also an author, and we have his book today, which he will sign. Great. Also, if you could go ahead and vote, what do we have? How many people do we have responding? I know there's way more than 22 people in here. If you want to go ahead and take a vote on that poll about your greatest barrier preventing you from adopting soil health practices, that would be fantastic. And then otherwise, please help me welcome Bob to the stage. Thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Lauren. She kind of let the cat out of the bag. You know, I only have 50 minutes to talk, so I decided to write a book, you see. And if I leave out anything, you guys can pick it up later. But anyway, it's a great honor to be here. I apologize to those that came to hear me last year and I wasn't here. I love experiments. So my big experiment last year was if I eat organic food all the time and I get plenty of rest and I do all these other things that you're supposed to do to take care of your body, and I don't get vaccinated, can I avoid COVID? Well, that experiment didn't turn out too well. And about this time last year, I was laying in bed, just sicker than a dog. And so then I had to call up Lauren. I said, I've got COVID. I don't think I'm going to make it tomorrow or whatever. Maybe I gave her 2 days notice. I don't know. It was really bad. But so my next experiment was, well, what happens to your antibodies? So let me show you what I've been doing. I've been tracking my antibodies because no one else does this much. And I have to drive almost 300 miles to the closest place to actually get them blood drawn and quantify them. But you see, it's been quite interesting. I got sick in December, so the first one was in January. It was way up high like it's supposed to be. And then I took a nosedive because that's what they say they do. And then I got a flu bug that I didn't think was COVID. And then I got a sinus infection the next month that I didn't think was COVID. And look at my antibodies. They shot right up, and they've been kind of bumping around pretty high ever since. And I haven't had any symptoms since, but I think I've been associated with enough people that are sick that I might be getting a little bit of a reaction to my antibody system. So you see the last 3 months here, and since this fall, they've been kind of inching up. So the bottom line to that story is I think my body's working the way it's supposed to, you see. And so I'm hoping to have enough natural protection to keep me out of the sick bed. Anyway, that's not what I came to talk to you about. I came to talk to you about regenerative organic agriculture and the future of food. This is where I live, Big Sandy, Montana. It's north central. If you know the geography, we've got mountains in the west and prairies in the east, and I'm on the prairie in the east. This is what Main Street looks like. It's 2 whole blocks. Used to be 1,000 people when I was in high school. Now it's down to 600. We were so excited a couple months ago. A new business came to town. And in a small town like this, any new business is pretty exciting. These were 2 brothers. One was a veterinarian, and the other was a taxidermist. And they put this big sign up at the end of Main Street in front of their building, and it said, Big Sandy Veterinary Clinic and Taxidermy. And then in very small print underneath it said, either way, you get your dog back. So anyway, I thought I'd start out with a little history. Big Sandy is in the middle of farm and ranch country. We have the Bear Paw Mountains that you may have seen the first slide about 3 miles to the north of us, and the Missouri River breaks about 3 miles to the south. And so we're kind of in the little bit of the prairie in between those two things. The homestead era started in about 1912 to 1915 or so. My great-grandfather, who was farming in Washington, came over with his big steam engine and thrashing machine and all the latest in harvest equipment in about 1919. About 10 people. It took about 10 people. If you count all the heads in there, there's about 10 people running that whole operation and making it work. It was a community effort, and they went around from farm to farm with this threshing machine, and it was a community thing. My grandfather came back from World War II, married his daughter, and started a farm in 1920, just joining him right up the creek. And so we celebrated a 100-year anniversary here a couple years ago. And this is his first pull-type combine in 1926, and he was so excited and proud of this. And now we're down to 2 people running this instead of 10, and maybe someone on the wagon to haul the grain away. He loved cows. That was his favorite thing. He told me the only money he ever made was with cattle because there's no inputs. You didn't have to buy any tractors and all this stuff. So he was a real cow person. My dad came back to the farm in 48, and this is his new combine in the early 60s now. It's self-propelled and brand shiny new, and his goal was to get the biggest yields he could. So he was one of the first to introduce chemical fertilizers and all the modern everything into the farm to try to increase our yields. And that's how I was raised. Then I came back to the farm in 78, and now we have a combine that has a cab, air conditioning. And I thought this was just, wow. No barley chaff down my neck and no hot sun shining on my head. It was fantastic. My goal, however, rather than having the biggest yield, was just to survive. When I came back to the farm, my background was I grew up loving 2 things. One was science and one was plants. And so I combined those 2, and I went to Montana State College and studied botany and plant pathology, and then I kept on going. I went to UC Davis and studied plant biochemistry, and after 10 years, I finished. And you think that 10 years would have been enough. I'll tell you, my folks really thought it was enough. And after 2 years in business for myself in Northern California, I decided to move my whole family back to the farm. And I didn't come back to the farm with an idea to change anything. I'd heard of organic, and I didn't give it much account, and I thought things were going pretty well the way they were. But when we got to the farm, we had 2,400 acres, as Lauren mentioned. That's the average size farm in Montana, and it's just right for 1 family. But for 2 families, it's a little bit of a stretch. Well, it's a lot of a stretch. And, I didn't want to send my wife to town. We had 3 kids already, or maybe 4 by that time. She had a full-time job with that. And besides, I needed her help driving truck in the harvest, and, she was a good help on the farm. I didn't want to send her I didn't want to go to town and get a job. So we tried to figure out, and we didn't have enough money to buy out the neighbors. That's the next thing that farmers do to survive. So I decided, what could we do to add value to what we already had? And I found then my solution was to not sell our grain anymore by the truckload, but to sell it by the pound. And so we found, I had a cousin in Southern California, and he said, I said to him, why don't you see if we can find some local bakers who would be interested in high-protein wheat, because that's one thing that we really could do. Our yields aren't great, but our protein is fantastic, makes fantastic bread. And he found a guy in California, a baker who was looking for high-protein wheat for his whole grain bakery, and we hooked up and we started Montana Flour and Grains. And you always hear the middleman makes all the money. Well, we made money our first month. I never had a business like that before or since. And we had almost no overhead. I mean, we cleaned our grain and put it in bags and shipped it off to California. And it was going fantastic. And then the second year, this is about 1983, second year, my customer called up and he said, hey, Bob, he says he's on the phone. He said, hey, Bob, he says, we love your wheat down here. He said, do you think you can find some organic wheat just the same kind of quality as that? And of course, when you're talking to your biggest customer, what do you say? Jim, don't worry about a thing. We'll have it for you in 10 days. And I hung up the phone. And I thought, my gosh, I don't even know any organic farmers. In fact, I don't even believe in this organic stuff because I have been taught all my life that a plant couldn't tell the difference between a nitrogen molecule coming out of a manure pile, as I thought, or one coming out of a bag of ammonium sulfate. And so I thought it was kind of a bunch of hooey, but I didn't let my thoughts about that subject interfere with with pleasing or giving our customer what they really wanted. So I started making calls, and I finally found some organic farmers, just one or two in northeast corner of Montana, about 300 miles away. Took my truck up, loaded it up. They signed a little affidavit saying it was organic. That was the rules in those days in California, and off it went. And Jim called up and he said, "This stuff's great." He said, "Can you give me another load?" And then another load, and another load. And pretty soon, well, I was really hustling to find the 3 or 4 organic farmers that existed in Montana at that time. But as I got acquainted with them, they invited me to one of their meetings. And I had been used to going to grain grower meetings and farm bureau meetings, and they're mostly, woe is me, the prices in the toilet, and what's the government program going to do, and on and on and on. And I went to this organic meeting, and they didn't talk about any of that. They talked about how it felt to walk over their field, and they could feel the tilth of their fields changing under their feet after they had converted to organic. They talked about how to control weeds with rotations. They talked about growing their own fertilizers, growing their own inputs using legumes. And then the scientist in me sort of boiled up to the top, and I said, wow, we got to try that on our farm. And I went home and I said, Dad, I said, we got to try this organic stuff. And he said, oh man, that's pretty risky. He said, we don't know what we're doing. I said, well, we'll start small. So we started with 20 acres. And this 20 acres had been in alfalfa for 2 or 3 years. And we worked that down, and we planted the winter wheat. And right next to that was our control of the chemical crop. And let's see, here's the next slide. So this is my experiment. So the first year, my friends told me, you've got to have ground cover to prevent weed infestation. So don't use your 14-inch space winter wheat drills that make deep furrows and catch the snow and prevent the wheat from winter killing and all that stuff. Use your 7-inch spring wheat drills, and then the wheat will be closer together and it won't have room for the weeds to grow. So I did that. And unfortunately, the field was on the road to town, and my neighbors saw me planting winter wheat with spring wheat drills, and that was already a cause for concern. And then when they found out I was doing organic experiment, then they thought I'd really gone Looney Tunes. But at the coffee shop, the consensus was, well, that kid has just been in California too long, you see. But anyway, they said, it'll winter kill, nothing will happen. So my first challenge was to see what happened in the spring. I got out there, and sure enough, the wheat was coming up. It hadn't winter killed, and I was so excited. And then we had some late season rains. That's unusual for us to have rains in July, mid-July. And the 14-inch spacing had plenty of room for the sun to shine between the rows. And when it rained that late in the season, because we only spray once with a herbicide, normally late May, early June, the weeds started coming up in the chemical fields, should we call them. And yet my fields were completely covered, and the weeds they came up, but they didn't get above the canopy. And at harvest time, my dad had in his field, they call it his field, he had some serious weed problems, but my organic field was clean. And well, he was kind of astonished about that. And then when we took harvest, the yields were almost the same. It was about 35, 36 bushel. And the protein was also about the same, about 15.3. And my dad was astonished. Here he had been paying tens of thousands of dollars year after year for all these inputs, and this young whippersnapper kid of his had come back from college and had duplicated his yields and all his protein with no inputs at all purchased off the farm. And I said, wow, this is great. My experiment worked. I said, let's convert half the farm next year. And my dad said, oh, wait a minute. He said, how about 10%? I said, how about 25? Well, we settled on 15, I think. Anyway, we started increasing our conversion to organic. And the next year we had grasshoppers. We had a drought. And if the droughts in Montana, we normally get grasshoppers. And I called up my friends and I said, well, I got grasshoppers. What do I do with my organic fields? Because I knew what to do with my chemical fields. You just call up the regular, the pilot in town who has the malathion spray plane, and he comes out and everything is sprayed, and your grasshoppers and everything else is dead immediately. And then he'd say to me, now, Bob, he says, now remember, you can't go in that field for 24 hours. And I said, I know. It's poison, you know. I said, yeah, I know it's poison. And meanwhile, my organic fields, I asked my friends, I said, don't worry, just, there's a product called Leucema locusta. It's a protozoa. It's a little bit smaller than a bacteria, bigger than a virus, and you just put it on wheat bran, and you spread it along the edge of your field before the grasshoppers infest the whole thing, because we could see them starting to come in from the pasture. And the grasshoppers came in, they ate that wheat bran with the protozoa on it, and they all got sick. And then their friends came, and they ate them. You see, it's just like politics in America today. Anyway, they ate it about 15 or 20 feet, and then they were gone. And so at harvest time, there was almost no grasshoppers. It wasn't a great crop. It was a drought year after all. It wasn't a great crop, but there were almost no grasshoppers in the combine tank. Meanwhile, with my chemical field, in about 10 or 15 days, the malathion had dissipated, and the next wave of grasshoppers came in. And at harvest time, I had as many grasshoppers as I had grain in the tank. And I said to my dad, I said, look at this. 2 years now, we've done this, we've been experimenting, and we've either exceeded or equaled what we have done with the best of chemistry. I said, I'm done with chemistry. I'm going to go cold turkey with the whole rest of the farm. And my dad said, okay. And I really appreciate that about him. He allowed us to really experiment on new territory, but he could see that there was something there that we could build on. So that's what we did. So my whole farm then became my laboratory. And what we were able to do after a few years, we could see that we lowered our input costs, we increased the value of what we were selling, we increased the economic and agronomic vitality of the farm, and for the farming, if any of you are farmers, you know that one of the perennial things that you do is get a big note from the bank for operating capital. In 3 years, we no longer had to have an operating capital loan because we had enough extra income and enough reduction of our expenses that we were starting to break even and make money without an operating note. That was huge. That was huge. And the biggest thing for me, it made farming fun again. I mean, every year was like a new game of chess. You didn't know the weather was a variable. Everything were variables, and you just had to figure out how to maneuver and make it work, and it was really fun. So after 30 years of experimentation and research, these are the principles that I came up with on our farm about regenerative organic. And I like to use those two terms together because I think together they mean so much more than either one by themselves. I tell my friends that organic that's not regenerative is just as deficient as regenerative that's not organic. And it's like having two ladders going up from two different directions, from the organic side and from the regenerative side. A lot of times the regenerative side is coming from really full chemical farms. But unless those two ladders meet at the top, where you have both of the best of both worlds coming together, you have not a complete picture. And I applaud any kind of progress from chemical agriculture toward regenerative organic. I don't care what side of the ladder you're on and where you're coming from and how fast you're going. But I am frustrated with my friends who stop along the way and say, we have arrived. I'm really worried about industrial organic. They're starting to buy inputs now to feed the plant. We don't feed the plant in regenerative organic. We feed the soil. And yet industrial agriculture has taught us to just look at the plants and feed the plant. We don't want to get in that mode, that mindset with organic, and if you connect regenerative to it, you avoid that. And yet I have some regenerative friends that say, oh, we just can't do without just a little bit of Roundup or a little bit of this or a little bit of that that's actually poison. And I haven't figured out, we talked a lot about no-till this morning. I haven't figured that out at my place, but I haven't given up trying to figure it out. And I think that we will someday. We're doing reduced tillage, but we're not able to figure out how to make no-till work. But it doesn't mean that we can't figure it out sometimes. So I like to use those two together because together they're worth way more than either of them separately. So the principles that I think are really important are first diversity. You know, you look at nature, you look at the forest, you look at the prairie, you look at the beach, the sea, the rivers, the lakes. There's no monoculture there. There's no monoculture. Monoculture is it's an artificial system that has to be buoyed up with lots of inputs to keep it working. And at some point it's going to break down, or we're going to run out of the resources that we need to keep it working. If you have diversity, you look out at any natural setting, and you've got plants and animals and microbes and everything that are taking and giving to that system constantly. And all of them together make it work. There's no fertilizer trucks that fertilize the prairie and the eons gone by, and yet it worked just fine. It was sustainable for generations, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the next principle I think that's really important is the soil regeneration, building the soils, having healthy soils. We think that a healthy soil plus high nutritious seeds are going to produce healthy food, which produces healthy people. And that should be our goal. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in more detail. The third thing, as I already mentioned, we feed the soil and not the plants. We build and support communities. We increase food security and focus on local. And I think that should be an intricate part of these of the discussions. So just to give you a couple examples, here I am building or turning down some alfalfa. So we use a rotation of legumes to build our soil. Alfalfa is my heavy artillery. If I really need a big boost in nitrogen, I have alfalfa. If I need some help against Canada thistle, that takes care of Canada thistle. If it's a good stand. And then after a year or two, I've got hay that I also can sell. We also grow sweet clover and peas, and those are also important contributions, that they have their own contributions. So the result is we don't have chemicals and we don't have fertilizer bills. Then the value of rotations also cannot be overstated. So here you see a picture of buckwheat. Is a plow down that we sometimes use, and that is such an aggressive plant that no weed stands up against that stuff. And it also solubilizes phosphate and brings it up to the surface of the soil. So that is also an added value. But the more that we have rotations break up cycles of diseases and pests, and insects, the more that we're going to avoid chemicals and the necessity for herbicides, pesticides. So there's no poison for the land and no poison for the people in our food. So this is just an example of what we're trying to do on our farm to mimic nature, to mimic the diversity of nature. We haven't had a lot of success yet with interseeding, and although that's another thing that's kind of ongoing experiments on my farm. But right now, in the last 20, 30 years, this is the rotation that we worked out. We have a green manure every other year that we work into the soil, that feeds the soil. And then we have 4 of those in between 5 cash crops. And you see the cash crops are all varying, spring seed, winter seed, and all that sort of stuff, broadleaf, narrow leaf, that kind of stuff. And that's how the program that we use on our farm mimics it. We only have 12 to 14 inches of rain a year. We don't have no irrigation. There's no way to, the groundwater beneath our soil is alkaline. There's too much salt to ever use it for irrigation. We're too far from any river to make that viable. So we are left to dry land, and we can only grow one crop in every 2 years. So you heard Elizabeth talking about growing 9 crops in 1 year, and we grow 1 in 2 years. So that's why if I put up the amount of money I was getting off my acres, I wouldn't need near as many zeros as Elizabeth was able to show. But it's okay, because we have a couple thousand acres to make up that. But every region has its own environment that we need to learn to work with and to bring the most out of it. And it's all different, but the principles are the same. The principles are the same wherever you go. So I know a lot of people are worried about cultivation. This is what some of our farms, some of the cover crops look like, a few green manures look like during the non-crop year. This is green peas. Work it a couple times with a noble blade, just undercuts them and leaves enough as possible on top of the ground. This is my favorite, yellow blossom sweet clover, when it was over 6 feet tall. When we got rain, it doesn't happen every year, but when it gets that tall and you disc it in, you leave about 6 inches of mulch on top, and it stays all summer like that. And so we don't get late summer rains I mentioned before, so the weeds don't grow and they can't even get started because they're well covered. And this is what our alfalfa looks like. But you always hear the complaint, oh, organic is so expensive. What are we going to do? You know, who can afford this? And I think and of course, the focus in this country is on abundant and cheap food, with the emphasis on cheap. And the farm programs have been the way that the commodity growers have been able to survive, because they don't get enough to pay for their expenses for what the grain is selling for. And so it's all been subsidized. But I'm here to tell you that there is a huge, huge expense and cost for cheap food, but you don't pay it at the checkout counter. It's paid along in different places much later. And these are some of the people that are paying for it. So first of all, the farmers. Half of the farmers in my neighborhood have gone broke or left or completely discouraged their kids from coming back to the farm because they say there's no money in this. We're not going to make it. The next generation certainly won't make it. So half of them are gone. I wouldn't call that a success story. That's one of the costs of cheap food. When the farmers go, then the small communities start to go. And I told you already that Big Sandy has gone from 1,000 to 600 people in the last 50 years. That's not an improvement. So that is another cost. Third cost is the earth. We are polluting the earth as has never been seen before. We have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico from chemical fertilizers that's as big as the state of New Jersey. So how big does it have to get before we start wondering if we're going in the right direction? People in Iowa cannot even drink. They don't give kids their water from their own wells because of the nitrate levels in it. We have Roundup in the rain that falls on our farm. And we've been organic for over 30 years, and yet we have contamination of Roundup that's coming out of the rain that we've been measuring for the last 3 years and trying to figure out exactly where it's coming from. It's a whole nother story. But anyway, the point is that we're spraying so many tons and tons of poisons and chemicals that everything is becoming contaminated. And that is leading, wrong button, to the next one. The next high cost of cheap food is to the health of our people. In this country, 60% of the population has at least one chronic disease, and 40% have 2 or more. And the CDC says that 60% of that is a result of poor diet. And if you're going to have, it doesn't matter what kind of healthcare system you have in the country. It doesn't matter. If you've got a majority of the country who's sick, the country's going to collapse under that. There isn't really a good future for that. So we really need to have a different, speak to that high cost somehow. And so in the end, we're all paying. We're all paying higher and higher taxes to help with these Band-Aid approaches, pills that make you feel better but don't go to the root of the health problem, cleanup programs and all this stuff that we wouldn't need if we were eliminating some of these chemicals. So after the 30 years, in my experience, and traveling all over the world, I really believe in seeing farms in many different parts of the world. I really believe that the regenerative organic is the future of agriculture, and it's the future of food, and it's the only future that really makes sense. It's a future that can mediate climate, which I didn't even mention. I mean, the climate chaos, I like to call it chaos because I think that's what it is. That is mostly due to industrial, or a lot due to industrial ag, could be mediated. We could mediate the decline in the farms, in our communities, and also, most importantly, I think we could mediate the decline in our health. So, there we go. Okay, now I'll tell you a few stories about off-the-farm stuff that we did. We started marketing with our flour mill and our grain company. We started in '83. In '86, we went to our first fruit show because I got you see that stone flour mill beside us in the booth? That's my parents. They came to help me with the Anaheim food show in California. We'd never been anything like that before. We didn't know what we were doing, and my dad built this booth, and we went down, and it was really fun. My cousin was helping me then in California, and at the end of 3 days, we had thousands of people go by our booth. My cousin and I had our pockets full of leads and business cards. And my dad had this ancient grain that actually, I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. And he was showing that to everybody because he was all excited about it. And at the end of 3 days, he had one lead and one business card, and actually they were the same. And he was excited. So it's just, it's how you look at stuff, right? And so we went home that year, and so my cousin and I were thinking we're going to make, really, this business is going to go really well. And my dad said, let's get our ancient grain out of the shed. And we planted half an acre in 1986. We had 0 products. Our farm was the only place that we had started it. 30 years later, and if you go to chapter 5, you can read all about that. 30 years later, we had 250 organic farmers we were contracting with. Over 100,000 acres were under production. Over 3,500 products were made throughout the world. And it was something that beyond our imagination as far as starting with a half an acre. We never imagined that something like this would happen with an obscure grain that no one knew anything about. This grain, and part of the success of this is because the way it affected people when they ate it. It's a very hard wheat. I have it in my hat because I like to carry it as close to my heart as I can get it, and it doesn't pack well in your suitcase. But anyway, it is very nutritious, and it is an ancient grain, so it hasn't been hybridized or changed in any way for hundreds of years that we've been doing changes here. This gal was a friend of ours, and she had all kinds of wheat sensitivities, and she was so sensitive to certain foods that she would just collapse if she had a taste or a whiff of them even. We had some of this grain made into pasta, and my dad was giving it all around to all his friends. He gave it some to her, and I said to him later, I said, Dad, why'd you give it to her? You know she can't eat wheat. And he said, well, for heaven's sakes, it's organic, isn't it? And you see, he's more converted than I am already. Anyway, she called up in a couple days and she said, what is this stuff? And she'd done some kinesiology muscle testing, so she knew she could try it. She said, when I ate this, it made me feel better. And I said, wow, well, we'll give you some more. And we did. And she says, I've got a sister, and she has all kinds of wheat sensitivities, and she's sensitive to other foods that she can't eat now, that she makes her sick. And you think she can try some? I said, sure, we'll send you a whole box full. So we sent a whole box full of pasta. And a month or so went by. She called up and she said not only could she eat it, but she was less sensitive to other foods. And I thought, oh, wow. This isn't just, we thought it was a novelty. I mean, we've been told this came out of King Tut's tomb and made a great story for marketing. But now, we found out that wasn't true, actually. But, which was a real bummer for me. But now, my attitude toward the whole thing changed completely. Now I felt like this is more like a gift from the Lord. This is like something preserved to help us feel better. And so, the scientists, again, kind of bubbled up onto me, and I thought, we need to research this. But when we decided to go this direction, we said, we need to take this more seriously. So we decided to have a trademark, and since we thought it came from ancient Egypt, I wondered what the ancient Egyptians called wheat. They called it Kamut. So since that was a dead language, we were able to register Kamut as a trademark, and that's how we used to market the grain. And so, since I own the trademark, this is the fun part, I get to make the rules. So the rules for a trademark are the guarantees that you give people that buy your product that they can expect. So the trademark doesn't mean we own the grain. We don't own the grain. I mean, the good Lord gave us the grain. He owns the grain. But we don't own it. But we own the trademark. And so if you want to use the trademark, these are the rules you have to follow. You have to be organically grown. It has to be 100% Coruscant wheat, which is the common name for this grain. It has to be high in protein and minerals, and you have to tell the truth about it. We didn't allow people to sell a Kamut cookie with 2% Kamut grain in it. It had to be over 50% if they're going to call it Kamut anything. So we tried to be really fussy about truth and labeling and that sort of thing. And then we tried to support the claims we were doing with research. So we spent a lot of money, a couple $1 million over the course of 13 years or so. I mean, I could have had a new boat or something, but we spent it on research instead because I really wanted to understand what was the difference between ancient wheat and modern wheat. And so we did a rat study in the beginning, and we found that there is a high antioxidant capacity of this grain compared to modern wheat. We expected that, but what we didn't expect is that there was a huge difference in how it responded with inflammation. It was actually reducing inflammation. So we know that inflammation is connected to all chronic disease. So we immediately went to medical research hospitals. In Italy, we couldn't find people that wanted to work with us very much in America because they didn't believe there was a problem with modern wheat 15 years ago. And in Italy, if you can't eat wheat, if you can't eat your daily pasta, I mean, this is a problem. And they didn't want to run down and buy wheat-free, gluten-free. They wanted it fixed. So they wouldn't understand what was going on. So we had a very receptive audience in Bologna, University of Bologna, University Teaching and Research Hospital in Florence. And in 13 years or so, we published 36 peer-reviewed journal articles, and we studied these diseases of clinical trials of people that had these diseases, and we're in double-blind studies. That means they ate the ancient wheat for 6 weeks, or the modern wheat, and then they had a washout period for 6 weeks, and they crossed over and they ate the other diet. So they're very well controlled. Even though there weren't huge studies, they were very well controlled. And the results were the same for every single one. We studied irritable bowel syndrome, cardiac disease, diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome, fibromyalgia, and the results were all the same. We saw an increase in anti-inflammatory properties, and that was the biggest thing. It was 30 to 40%. Pills cannot do that. Medicine doesn't do this. Remarkable amount of increase. Antioxidant capacity was increased. Cholesterol, blood sugar, insulin resistance is all down. Magnesium, zinc, and calcium in the blood were all up. These are also very important health factors. This really opened a whole new window on the world for me. And I heard the phrase, food should be your medicine, medicine should be your food. Now it really started to mean something to me. And I thought, this is like a new window on the world. And if it's true for wheat, why is it not also probably true for the rest of the food that we eat? And anything that we have greatly changed just to get more yield is probably something that we found in wheat was being lost. And nutrition and other values we don't even know about is being decreased, and therefore the increase in disease. So let's talk about wheat for a second. I'm a wheat farmer, and so the big push now for wheat-free, gluten-free, I take personally, you see. It's kind of an insult to me. And you think, well, what's the matter with wheat? But look what we've done to it over the last 50, 70 years. The whole goal, as we talked about before, has been increasing yields at the farm level, increasing yields at the bakery. Increasing yields at the farm level meant that we made wheat smaller. So there's an example of several different wheats going from the heirloom or ancient grains down to the most modern semi-dwarfs, and you can see the differences. We also made the wheat so that it was adaptable to high levels of nitrogen-soluble fertilizers so that it would respond and make a lot of yield. We made it more resistant to disease, and that's not bad, and also in some cases resistant to insects. But we also, in the bakery level, changed the gluten. So then you see the bread examples going from a poor gluten to a very strong gluten, which would hold. So in the way bread is made, you add yeast and sourdough, you add bacteria too, to digest the starch and the sugars into carbon dioxide. Gases perform, among other things, but the gas then makes the bread rise. And if you have a strong gluten, you have bigger bubbles forming inside that bread. And so imagine this, if you're a baker, and you can sell air for the price of bread. This is really good. And so they like that. They could make more bread with less wheat. And so that's what was happening. And there was a great excitement about this. The trouble was there were unintended consequences. No plant breeder is going to start out and say, well, I'm going to make a plant that's not nutritious anymore. That's not what their goal was. They just focused on another goal, and they had these unintended consequences. So the biggest trouble, however, were the people who could no longer eat the wheat. a lot of the fingers are pointed to the change in the gluten being made so stronger. So it wasn't a question of quantity of the gluten, it was a question of the quality of the gluten and how the body was able to respond to that and break that down. Also, we have the effect of glyphosate residues on the wheat, which acts as an antibiotic in your gut. You know, there's more bacteria cells in your gut than there are human cells in your body. And so if you do something to interrupt that, the glyphosate doesn't harm human cells or mammalian cells, but it really does a number on plant cells and many bacteria. So if you start hurting the bacteria in your gut, you're going to have trouble. And that's what's going on for some people. Anyway, the result is that between 12 and 20%, up to 20% of people can no longer enjoy wheat the way they used to. So let me tell you another story that changed my whole outlook on the way I farm. This is my wife. She often, well, sometimes, helped me at the food shows, which I really enjoyed. And at this one food show we were at, a lady came up to me, just right out of the blue, took my hand, shook it real vigorously, and she looked right into my eyes, and she said, "Thank you for growing food for my family." And I thought, wow. No one ever thanked me for growing food before. But, you know, a wheat farmer doesn't go to the farmer's market. We never see our end customers, ever, as a normal wheat farmer, because we take a truckload of grain into an elevator and dump it in a big pit, and the elevator man comes out, checking the grain, trying to figure out if he can find something wrong that he can dock you for and pay you less. That's how we're thanked. So to hear a thank you for a wheat farmer like me, I mean, it was just like a change in my whole outlook. I went home from that food show because I had been growing commodities all my life. You know, we talked about commodity markets, we talked about the commodity everything. I went home from that show and I never grew another commodity on my farm ever again. The only thing I grew on my farm from then on was food. Good food, food that would nourish people, food that would bring them health and vitality, food that would extend their lives and help with people in aging and people who were growing and the most important times for nutrition. And that's what I did. And that was the beginning of a whole new chapter for me in my life. And it was the result of just one person coming up to me and expressing personal thanks for something that she enjoyed with her family. So let me tell you about a couple other projects that we did on our farm. You know, in the homestead era, everybody grew their own vegetables. There wasn't any Costco or Walmart or anything like that. You grew your own. There wasn't transportation, anything. In my youth, still, everybody had a garden. We had pigs. We had a milk cow. We had chickens. All that's disappeared now. Nobody has time for that. A lot of farmers are working off the farm. Their wives are working off the farm. The kids are in too many sports and playing too many video games, so they're not there helping so much. And what we need to do, I think, is to take stock at really what we're doing and the time commitments we've made. Everybody has more than they can do now, and they don't want to be bothered with a garden. So. And even more unthinkable is a dryland garden, which you don't irrigate. Well, we don't, as I mentioned before, we don't have the luxury of irrigation. So I've been experimenting with dryland vegetables. So why am I doing that? Well, I think we're running out of water. I think that when the water crisis really hits, and it's starting to hit now, it'll make the fuel crisis look like Disneyland. And there'll be, there's going to be water wars, you know, however that might turn out. But if it's going to be agriculture against the cities having water, guess who's going to win that fight or discussion? So, also the supply chains are too long, becoming undependable. We're depending on cheap inputs that we don't get sometimes. You know, 60% of the sunflowers used in America were grown in Ukraine. Well, that was really a good idea. And it was probably to save, we can grow sunflowers here, but it was probably to save a little more money and make a little more money by the dealers, the traders. And so we were depending on a country now that the crops are out of order. They're not existing the way they used to be. And so we're scrambling to make up the difference. That was a bad position to get in the first place. there's increasing interest in local production all the time and food security. And if you have fresh stuff, you know, we heard a little bit this morning about sometimes the organic doesn't match up as far as some of the things that they test. A lot of times, and if you dig down into the details of what's going on, some of that organic produce is coming out of stores that have been sitting there for weeks, and it's not fresh as the stuff coming out of Costco or high turnover stores where maybe they've just been off the field a day or two. But imagine if you can have food in your locality that was picked the day before or and right nearby. And that freshness turns into nutrition and also taste and enjoyment and value. So here's some of my experiments with dryland vegetables. This is potatoes. And I've found some that I've had really good success with. Potatoes are one. What I discovered, if they'll work just fine in dry land if I spread out the plants. So I give them about 3 times more room than you do if you can irrigate or you would in your garden. Give them about, they're planted in rows 3 feet apart, and the plants are 3 feet apart, and they yield just about as much as a single plant that's irrigated. But I only have 1/3 as many plants. That means my yields altogether about 1/3, but it's okay. We have lots of land, and it's not very expensive. I don't have to pay for water, and I think it could be viable. We've done a lot of experiments with squash. And potatoes, too, we started with 42 different varieties, and I ended up with 4 that are really doing well with dry land. With the squash, I started with 25 different varieties. I'm down to 3 or 4 of those that I really like. Onions do really well for us. We can grow tomatoes, watermelon when I was a kid. So I tell people, ask me, what about this climate change? You know, some of it's climate change deniers. And so they want to know if I believe in climate change. And I say, well, I don't know much about climate change, but let me show you a picture of my watermelon that's now 35 pounds and tell you, when I was a kid, I planted watermelon every year. I never got anything bigger than a softball. They never got ripe. They were never any good. And now I have 35-pound watermelons in northern Montana, just 50 miles south of the Canadian border. You tell me if something has changed. And of course I tell them then, you know, this climate change, it's not all bad. We never could grow watermelons before, but anyway, you have to adapt, you know. Here's our sweet corn. We also plant that quite a bit further apart than normal. Here's Indian corn, which is also very high in nutrition and does well in dry land. The other thing that I've experimented with that people said you couldn't do where we live is an orchard. So I found out that we're in zone 3. That means 40 below zero is expected during the winter, although it's been a while since we had that. But sometimes it can get pretty darn cold. So I started experimenting with different apple varieties. There found 200 that can grow good in zone 3. And there's a picture of them in smaller plants and now some mature ones. And they're delicious and they're fresh. And you know, I had a group came out from the local ag class in school. One kid told me, he said, oh, I don't like apples, I never eat apples. I said, well, just try this one. And it was my favorite one. And it was called Zester. And he took a bite of this apple, and he said, wow, I never had an apple like this before. You know, that was just like money in the bank to me. And so I have a convert, somebody who can enjoy something local, something that's really good, something that's not really available in the grocery store. Anyway, there's more things that we can do. We can grow grapes. I make vinegar out of grapes and also sour cherries. It's a wonderful product. I don't even buy balsamic vinegar from India anymore after my sour cherry vinegar. But you can take sour cherry juice, mix it with apple juice, and have a nutritious, tangy breakfast drink that's better than orange juice. There's not an orange tree within 1,000 miles of where we are in Montana. Why are we patronizing those folks like that every day? We could have our own industry of our own business of growing fresh fruit and having a breakfast drink. So the other thing that I'm really big on is revitalizing rural America. So the third thing I want to visit with you about is taking the crops we already grow and adding value to them right on the farm. So one of the 2 things that we've been doing, it also brings jobs to our community and keeps local and keep it regional. That's my theme. So, okay. One of the things we're doing is the oil barn, where we are making vegetable oil out of high oleic safflower oil. And it is a monounsaturated oil. It's the best kind of oil for your heart. It's really good for high temperature cooking. I supply all the, it's cold pressed, it's non-refined, it's high oleic safflower. and it's local. And so we have good markets with, I buy all the cooking oil from Montana State University and University of Montana, and they take quite a bit because there are lots of people there, students, and they use it for fry oil, and then I get the oil back, and I dewater it, and I filter it, centrifuge it, take out the big pieces, filter it, take out the little pieces, and then I can use it and put it in my diesel engine. I can sell it twice. If you can sell any of your crops twice, this really increases the value and the bottom line, I tell you, for sure. So this is something we can do. Then the other business is Montana, or Big Sandy Organics, and we combine our ancient grain with the safflower oil, add a little salt, and make a tasty snack, which comes in a bag like this, and I should have brought a bag for everybody, but we'll put out a couple, maybe at the afternoon break, where you can have a spoonful, and at least try it. And now we're selling, imagine this, now instead of by the truckload, I'm selling my wheat by the ounce. This is a big improvement. This is a big improvement. So, the future of food. And dream with me a little bit here. I'm going to go through this is the conclusion real quick. So what if farmers were paid by quality they produce? What if they were paid and we focus on nutrients per acre rather than bushels per acre or tons per acre? I wonder if they can make a decent living from a fair return for what they put in to what they grow. Wonder if foods were labeled in the store to show the nutrient value that actually exists in those foods, and people can compare. And so when they worry about prices, well, you can say, well, I can pay $5 and I can get this much nutrient density, or I can pay $3 and I can get this much. I think that if we had a good system of labeling and testing for nutrient density, we could drive the market in the direction that we all want to go and where everybody wins. Wonder if we paid a little more for good food and a lot less for health care. People say, how am I going to pay for that? Well, how are you paying for your health care? For heaven's sakes, it's going through the roof. Well, no one knows. But if you pay a little bit for your food and support good agriculture and nutrition and regenerative, organic, and nutritious food, we could pay for that easily out of the savings for the health care we wouldn't need. Instead of enriching big pharma for expensive pills, how about if chronic disease was treated with nutrient-dense food and that was grown locally and minimally processed? And finally, what if all this could be accomplished with regenerative organic agriculture? So, you want to change the world? Be the change you want to see by one bite at a time or one field at a time. So, if you are an eater, when you go shopping, put one more item in your grocery basket that's organic than you did the last time. If you're a farmer, convert one more field to regenerative organic than you had the season before. This is what we could do. This is where we've been. In the last 30 years, since I first got started, we were near zero in the marketplace for organic products in the market. Right now, we're nearly 6% of the entire U.S. market is organic. And it's growing, well, this last year or so, it's been over 10%. But an average growth rate of 8% in 35 more years, we're going to be at 100 if we work hard, if that's what our goal is. If we can, but it can be done. So, in summary, here's 8 things you can take home to, if you want to help in converting your farm. First of all, check out what the neighbors are doing. Go to meetings like this one, and check out any kinds of messages on the media. This is one thing I don't want you to do. Scratch this right out of your mind. Can't be done here. Well, we've never done that before. How many of you heard that, right? Experiment. Start slow. Start small. Build on the success and kick out the things that aren't working right away. If you're going the wrong direction, does it really make sense or help to go faster or get bigger? Never give up. And don't mind what the neighbors are saying, for heaven's sakes. Be an example to them of what they could do. Mimic nature. Avoid industrialization of ag and food. And keep it simple. And link food and health in your mind and in your promotion and in your life. Use good seed and healthy soil to make good foods and healthy communities. Finally, work together, share success and failures, and have fun. So, in the end, eat organic, grow organic, be wise, be well, be thankful, be kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. You get to stay right up there.
Okay.
All right. So if you have questions for Bob, please enter them into our Slido queue, and we will put them up. I guess first I'll put up, we have a baker. We probably have more than one baker in the audience, but they really appreciated your talk. So anyway, maybe they got to try some of your ancient grains, though.
Oh,
Maybe.
I should have brought more.
That's true. Another thing to know, I heard Bob first on John Kempf, another a speaker that we've had here in the past. He has a podcast, Advancing Eco-Agriculture. Bob has been a guest on that podcast, and if you need to hear more from him, it's on there as well.
And everybody's welcome to come visit us anytime. We have an open door policy at my house, so you're all welcome, and feel free to come, and you can see all that you want to see and ask any questions you want to ask. So.
Okay.
Okay, that's a good question. What happened to my cows? You notice I didn't comment much about cows. My dad, when I was growing up, we had 50% of our farm was pasture, 50% in crops. So we had about a 50 head cow-calf operation, polled Herefords, that was our favorite. I don't hardly see many of those anymore, but as I came back and I told you about my love of plants, the thing I love about plants is when you put them in the ground and you go back the next day or in a week later, they're still there, right where you put them. And I've never been kicked by a wheat plant ever. So, it's all right. I do like cows, but I love plants, so I've been focused on that. So what happened when I started traveling on these food shows in the mid-'80s or late 80s, my wife said to me, honey, I'm not going to feed these cows when you're gone. And I said, oh, well, okay. The winter's cold and snowy. You have to chain up the pickup, and you have to, go out and pitch hay, and so I got rid of the cows. I leased out my cows, I leased out my pasture, and now I have retired. So I never really got to evolve the organic and the animal component the way I would like to now, because now I have a lot of new ideas about how they can go together better. And so now the last 5 years I've leased out my farm, and I've downsized. I've downsized from 4,000 to 4 acres, and I tell you, it takes me just about the same amount of time to farm the 4 acres with a hoe as it did the 4,000 with a big tractor. So, but it's more fun because I'm growing all my own food. I'm trying to grow all my own food. I'm up to about 85% now of what I eat at home is what I grow. So I'm really having fun with that. But the people I've leased out my farm to were people who work for me for 5 years, 3 years, and they have gotten cows back because they're not traveling all winter and marketing the way I did. So they're starting to reintroduce that. But that was a good question. And I think where you can do large animals, particularly if large animals were a part of the system before you got there, it's an advantage to have them now. So that's where we are. Western soils are often low in what?
Western soils are often low in phosphorus. Do you add phosphorus, or do you have phosphorus deficiencies?
Well, our soil is not low in phosphorus, but it's tied up. We have plenty of phosphate, but it's all tied up because our pHs are so high. We're an alkali system, and so what we have seen is that if the plants then, rather than adding extra phosphorus, if the plants we saw the slide earlier about those root exudates, if the plants can, those root exudates are feeding large populations of microbes, and those microbes are solubilizing phosphorus, and that is feeding the plants. So the more alive your soil is, the more healthy it is, the more life you have in the soil, the more that phosphorus, if you have it in the soil, which we do, bound up, is going to be released to your plants. So we don't really see phosphate deficiencies in our plants, but it certainly has made it able for us to receive the benefit of that phosphorus by having healthier soils and more living soils. And if you're having a dead soil, then you do have to apply phosphate to it.
Okay, and our last question, and please know Bob will be on the panel this afternoon, and we can address more of those questions then too. But our final question for you by yourself is, do you think your transition to organic has improved your resilience to water shortage challenges?
Oh, that's really a good question. So remember when I talked to you about diversity? And we had 5 different cash crops instead of one, or sometimes wheat and barley is what the predominant crops were. A perfect example of how that can work to our advantage is that we had a real bad hailstorm in late July. A couple of years ago, and the alfalfa hay had already been harvested and was in the shed. No loss from that crop. The winter wheat was almost ready to be cut. There's severe loss from that crop. The barley was standing up, almost ready to be cut, and every single kernel was taken off. The barley was 100% loss. Everything, a single kernel was just stripped off of that stalk. Then we had safflower that was just just ready to start to bloom. It held up very well. It got knocked around a little bit, but it didn't break it down. And so we had a normal safflower crop, as though there wasn't any hail. Let's see, and the other thing we had were peas. And the peas were intermittently damaged because they also, at that time, weren't completely ripe. So the losses we had, if we just had one crop, we could have a complete devastation 100%. But because we had many different crops, we had the diversity that some were damaged more than others, and some were already harvested, and some were not damaged at all. So that is one of the keys to being resilient during extremes in weather. In that case, it was a hailstorm, not a drought. But the drought is the same way. Our summers now are becoming hotter sooner and drier sooner. That's making our spring-seeded crops higher and higher risk. But the fall-seeded crops are still doing fine. And so part of my experiments now is seeding normal spring crops in the fall and looking for winter hardiness in safflower, in our Kamut grain, in other grains, in peas, and other crops that we grow, so that we can have the advantage of looking for things that are more adaptable and more resilient to the climate change that we're facing, because we have to do something for right now. The solution to climate change isn't going to happen between now and May, but what we choose to plant will happen between now and May. So that's one thing that we're doing to respond to that. So thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Bob. Really appreciated that.